You are listening to Single Serves. My name is Arno Marture and I am your host. Single Serves is a podcast dealing with design, architecture, business, and city building in which I interview an expert on a specific subject matter. Together, we dive into that topic and challenge conventional thinking in a thought-provoking conversation. For our inaugural season, we have some great guests lined up, and you can expect to hear about such topics like social media for architects, organizational culture, criticism in media, and architects not practicing architecture, among many others. I sincerely hope that you will find these conversations as engaging as I did and learn a thing or two in the process. Don't forget to send us your comments, criticism, and praise. To do so, you can email us at hello@rvltr.studio or leave a comment online. You can also subscribe to the podcast on our website at rvltr.studio and follow us on social media under the handle at Révélateur_TO. It's REVELATEUR_TO. Today I have the pleasure to have with me on the podcast Kelly Doran. Kelly is a principal at Mass Design Group in the UK. He's also a professor at the Bartlett in London. He's a Canadian architect and graduate from the University of Toronto. Thanks, Kelly, for being on the show.
Thank you.
So let's start with a little bit of your background. Can you tell us who you are in 3 sentences or less?
I came from Winnipeg and studied, grew up in the prairies, studied architecture in Winnipeg and Toronto, practiced in Canada the better part of, I think, about 5 years. And then subsequently I've kind of moved to, work abroad. Spent the last 7 years working in Kigali, Rwanda, and with Mass Design Group. And, find myself now trying to start a practice in London at this pretty unique time in history.
So can you tell us a little more about Mass Design Group and what makes it different?
Yeah, I think, so the people who've heard of us, probably the first question we typically get is, you're a nonprofit, what does that mean? And we started, I think, interestingly enough, we started just over a decade ago now, and we're born out of a healthcare nonprofit, which I think, given on what's going on right now in the world is interesting to think about more so. We are asked to work with partners in health to help conceive and design and construct a hospital in rural Rwanda. And through volunteering with this healthcare group, whose mission is to provide healthcare to the poorest of the poor, I think we developed an approach to design and in architecture, engineering, and the various disciplines within it that see design not as a commodity, but as a right, and as something that basically, for everybody that deserves access to healthcare, we believe that everybody also deserves access to good design. And emerging from a healthcare nonprofit and applying that to architecture and to design, I think what the model allows you to do a couple things. One, it opens up the forms of revenue that you can access. We are at this point, we are about 80% fee-based revenue, and the other 20% is through fundraising, which allows us to, put our talents towards projects that need them, instead of, quite often, I think architects put their efforts towards projects for free or to people that could afford them but are unwilling to pay for them. And it kind of brings your services to a far different public, frankly. I think the other advantage of being a nonprofit is, as a nonprofit, legally you have to be mission oriented. We have a board of governors that make sure that everything we do falls within our mission statement, and it means that everything you do, you have to it has to be held up to the light and be understood. Is this mission aligned? Is this an organization that we should be working with? Is this a project that demands our service? And I think that makes you interrogate what it is you're doing, I think, differently, and also forces you to say no, and in many aspects also gives you the luxury to say no to work potentially, and also to say yes to work that you might not otherwise think you could take on. And I think that over the last 10 years has proved out to be, at this point, I think we're the largest design nonprofit in the world, and has proven out to be, I think, it's a successful model, and one that we hope others look at and try to create.
So it's very interesting you say that, because I've been coming to my own conclusion about the way most architecture firms work, is that architecture is by and large a a luxury service for the elites because it's a very expensive service. And I think your business model addresses one possible way to turn that on its head. And you said something very interesting a few minutes ago that allows you to put resources towards projects that need design as opposed to clients that can afford it. Can you tell us a little more about that and what that means exactly?
Yeah, I think some of our best projects started from a group or an individual that had their like a really a good idea, and also kind of a mission that was aligned with ours, that would not otherwise have at that point the funding to take an idea and give it a kind of concept design, give it kind of do that early sort of visualization type work and that early conceptual work to translate their idea into a rendering or a model or something that you could then take and get further funding with, right? This happens all the time. This is that kind of like pre-concept work that people do with developers all the time for free. But seldom are you doing that work for organizations that really need that to attract donors or grants or the other kind of funding. People that this is not their business. And I think like a good case of where this is proven out is with the Equal Justice Initiative project in Montgomery, Alabama. We got wind of Brian Stevenson having an idea for a memorial around the history of lynching on the back of the report that they put out, basically unearthing this history and this trauma in that country's history that has never really been dealt with. And we asked, we'd love to work with you. Is there something we can do? And we basically brought forward funding of our own that was fundraised, through our kind of fundraising mechanism, and worked with them for the better part of the year to put together a concept that ultimately then got funded in whole and then translated into this incredible memorial, which is now, I think, out there in the world and changing the opinions of, or changing the perspectives of many people about the specific history of the United States. That I think we've done across a number of different projects. We're currently building a hospital in Liberia, where because of the nonprofit, we raised a pretty significant sum of money to go and work with the World Bank and with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, work with the Ministry of Health there to put together a program and put together, the basic requirements that the World Bank needed to then fund the beginning of this hospital project. That is the kind of thing. Those are the kind of places that we, basically put our funding towards to help make projects happen that might not otherwise take place.
So is it fair to summarize this as concept design as a fundraising tool?
Yeah, I mean, quite often I think fundraising people are visual. I think we see something and we're like, oh wow, okay, I really want to get behind that, and it's more than words. And I think this is what we can provide as designers. Is what we do all the time. Is give an idea form and give it a kind of visual that gets people to say, oh, I see. Or in the case of Liberia, take the idea of we need a hospital and give that form in the way of a program document and a budget and a costing and make it real in that sense. So I think this is where design thinking has a lot of potential of getting upstream. I've kind of said a few times, like if you're entering at the RFP stage, you're already too late. You need to get up upstream as possible and get in the conversation before that RFP is even happening, because that's where you can really shape a project. And it's not just a kind of like architects here, take it from here, find the communities, find the people that are just beginning to think of something and really help shape it at that point, because that's when it's most malleable. And I think where you have the most potential impact as a designer to influence it.
That's very interesting, because there's been a fair bit of conversation, and I've been part of in some of that in Ontario specifically, about RFPs as a really bad way to procure architecture, for a number of reasons that we don't really need to get into. There's another podcast that I've done with Tone Dreesen, who's one of the former presidents of the OAA, who's expanding a lot on that. So it's interesting you say that, because it kind of intersects with some of those ideas that we've discussed before. You said early on in the conversation that the way you operate and the business model allows you to say no to a lot of projects and work with clients that are aligned from a purpose perspective. So do you do only purpose-driven work, or do you do more traditional architecture as well?
By mandate, we can only do mission-aligned work. And I would argue that all architecture should be purposeful. So I think all our projects align with what we are, basically kind of in a way, buildings that are out there to, promote a just society and that serve the society. MAS stands for a model of architecture serving society. So I think our work is intentionally public and targeted at 100% of the population. So does that limit us from doing housing? No, we're working on housing right now in Boston and Cleveland. That is a range of, it's affordable housing. It is looking at housing for a wider population base, right? It's working with community development corporations. There's no typology that's off the books here, but it has to be, I think it needs to pass the litmus test of like, ultimately, is this building serving the public, writ large.
Mm-hmm. So you said that Mass Design Group has been around for about 10 years. Have you been involved with it since the beginning?
No, I joined Mass just over 6 years ago now. I met Michael fortuitously through some mutual friends. And at the time, my wife and I were planning to move to Africa. And he said, great, we need somebody to help us, lead our office in Kigali. I had not ever thought about moving to Rwanda. 2 months later, found myself there and could not have found a better situation to practice architecture, frankly.
So what have you learned so far from building in developing countries?
Yeah, so the biggest lesson learned was unlearning, meaning it took the better part, I think, about 6 months to a year for me to really come to terms and begin to think like, wait a minute, I don't know anything, or all the things that I thought I know do not really apply necessarily to what is demanded of architecture in a context like Rwanda. And to explain that is it taught me everything I never learned in school and in 5 years of practice, which I think I've been reflecting a lot on ever since, and has completely reframed how I understand, the practice of architecture. And the way I would kind of explain it is there's this builder that we work with quite a bit from the beginning called Bruce Nazay. And I drew a window for the hospital project that I was leading, a rectangle. And he came back to me and said, well, yeah, but what do you want? What kind of window do you want? I'm like, I just, rectangle. He's no. He's like, what kind of glass do you want? How thick? If it's this thickness, it comes from Tanzania. If it's this thickness, it has to come from Kenya. And they have this kind of truck or this kind of truck. And if it's steel frame, it's this size or this size. And I can use this welder or this welder. And then all of that, then you can have a window. And then the cost. I'm like, wow, wait a minute. Everything that you just explained, I need to understand that to actually draw the window, because, up until then in North America, you can draw a rectangle and say, refer to manufacturer, and you're done, right? Yeah. And it shows up on site and somebody puts it in there. He asked a question that like you actually had to design the window, and to design it, you had to understand everything about how that window was being made. And that is a lesson that I constantly had to come back to and think about in every aspect of a building, because in a place like that its supply chains are just they're in the open. Things are being made next to you. To have a construction site, there's a shop that they're making the windows and doors for the project and the furniture on the job site. Things are literally being made by hand in and around the project. They're not just coming off a truck from some like manufacturer, in some other part of the country or the world. And this taught, this is a kind of like form of thinking about design that's completely holistic, where you actually understand the labor, you understand the impact of your decision all the way down the supply chain. And the more that come attuned to this, we're also, because Rwanda's landlocked from an economic perspective, the more you could figure out to build within the country because of import tax and transportation costs and things of that nature, the more that you can source in the country, the more economical it's going to become. And it really has led to our practice where we now understand pretty much where all the materials come from, where the quarries are, where the brick makers are, where the specific stone comes from, etc. And we know who makes them, and we know the crafts and all the kind of people that are involved in the making these things. And I think our architecture has become very regional in that sense, and has become very connected not just to the kind of materials of the place, but frankly to the labor of the place as well, and understanding that direct impact. So this is a lesson that can only be taught in a place like that, where people, there you go, the developing countries kind of moniker that is subscribed to it, where it's resource limited, relatively speaking, but that resource limited leads to resourcefulness. It leads you to think about all the different ways that you can use something. And frankly, looking back on how I practiced previously, totally lazy. Architecture up to that point was a kind of formal exercise, which you could then go to the wall of catalogs and pick out the manufacturer that you might have had the lunch and learn with from the week before and said, oh, great, I'll use their window, draw a rectangle, done, move on to next decision. Never really thinking about that window, who made it, where it's come from, what the impacts of that decision are. And in the thousands of decisions you need to make out of catalog picking in kind of Canadian architecture, never once was it kind of, did I think to stop and think about, wait a minute, who is actually making that thing, And that proximity in a place like Rwanda is frankly, kind of a luxury, where the opacity and the distance we have from those decisions in a place like Toronto at this point reveals to you everything that's frankly wrong with architecture.
That's great. And I think it's a perfect segue in my next question, because I've come across an article you've written for Canadian Architects, kind of criticizing the complexity that Western architecture had engendered over the last few decades. Why do you think have buildings, ironically, based on what you just said, become so complex when you can select things from a kit of parts, but the building codes and the way buildings are assembled have become incredibly complex compared to even 40 or 50 years ago? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, just reflecting in the 20 or so years that I've been, kind of in the field, either as a student or as a practitioner, and looking back in history to what did a building look like 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. As you can see, I'm in the attic of my house right now. Very simple envelope, a slate tile on top of some rafters, right? Mm-hmm. And why has that changed over time? And I think I can, over the last 20 years, it's safe to say that architecture has been operating under sustainability as kind of like, your buildings need to be sustainable. And that covers more or less operational efficiency, i.e., tighter air barriers, higher thermal performance in walls. The space has become more mechanic. All of the things that the sustainability has been describing, like when I was a student, like double skin curtain walls were like the way to do it because the building down the street just had one, right? All of the things like this have led to our fascination with trying to drive our utility bills down and increase our value has led to buildings going from about 2 or 3 layers of material to 13 layers over the last 20 to 30 years. And not only have we added layers, but we have become less familiar with what each of those layers actually does. And more so what that layer is made out of. And again, I think where it's come from. And ultimately the provenance of that material and the impacts that it has on the environment before it gets to your building. So this complexity, I mean, I will take one material, or I'll take 2 materials to explain like what the issue is. And I think a rigid foam insulation is the easiest one to talk to because it's a material that didn't exist in buildings only a couple decades ago. And it is, when I graduated, it's the standard thing you put on the outside of any foundation in Canada, 2 inches of XPS rigid foam, blue or pink, your choice. And I've stopped to think about, okay, wait a minute, what is this material? Like it's clear it's a petrochemical. Its carbon footprint is through the roof. I think we're only beginning to now understand that the blowing agents required to make it, or that have been used to make it, have greenhouse gas warming potentials that are far off the chart of what people thought. We're wrapping our buildings in layer after layer of this material to make them higher performing, right? But in doing so, we've polluted the environment to make them. We've extracted them from sources like as bad as fracking and what that does. The places that they're made are worse off from every kind of environmetric and health metric you could think about. And then ultimately, by the time they're on your building, it's a safe bet to say that any savings that they might have over the life of that building, they probably already expended before they even showed up on the job site. So that whole holistic view is only something that personally I have come to understand very recently, and certainly as a field, I think we're starting to grapple with. On the other end, another material which I think is a pretty classic material in anywhere Toronto, or let's say urban Canada, is a kind of window wall system on any high rise in Toronto, where that window wall is, it's aluminum and glass largely. And of all the materials that have high carbon footprints, cement, steel, and aluminum those buildings is primarily what they're made out of, right? And we're building these at a rate like other parts, like that's other than like Asia. No one is building faster than Canada at the specific typology. And these are materials that, aside from having incredibly high carbon footprints, where are they coming from? Who is making them, like ultimately? And I think reflecting the work I had done, almost a decade ago, working on mine sites around the world, with at that point Planning Alliance and Replant, seeing the other end of the equation. I've seen the kind of zinc and copper mines, the bauxite mines, aluminum was being mined, and I saw it at the other end where it's getting installed in a building. But everything in between, you have no idea, right? And I don't think most people really understand even where bauxite comes from, right? How does that aluminum window come into being, and whose hand does it pass through? How many different stages along the way? Is labor along that entire course just fairly treated, not exploited? What is the environmental repercussions of this material? And I think, the current situation with COVID, bringing people to really be aware of, wow, wait a minute, our health is inextricably linked to the environment. And I think there's a kind of global awakening right now, I hope, about the decisions I make, not just what I eat and how I travel, but what I build with. Because as architects, we have architects and engineers have a disproportionate impact on global warming. We're half of the problem. And our decisions are half of the solution. So I think the quicker that we really come to understand, the profound impacts that we can have, the more positive our profession is going to be as a part of the solution of this hole that we've dug ourselves into.
So the impact of the profession on the environment has been known for at least 2 decades. It goes back as far as I can remember when I first started architecture school almost 20 years ago. So why is the industry so slow to react? Or are there forces at play that we're not aware of that prevent things from changing?
I'm not sure we did understand how big a part of the equation we were, frankly. I certainly didn't. Certainly was not any part of my education a decade ago. And I think even now, looking around schools, it's still not being taught as widestream as you might think it's kind of mainstream as it should be. So I don't think this realization is now. I don't think people really understand that the built environment accounts for half of emissions annually, and that buildings are 40% of them. So if we all know that, okay, and of that makeup, 30% is operational carbon, and the other 10% is embodied. And you understand that embodied is just once you've spent it, it's done. It's in the world, and there's no getting it back. Then I think if you understood that, wow, we are everything designing and building is 10% of the problem every year, we would be thinking quite differently. Excuse me. So I think coming to that reality for me has been very recent, and the more I kind of talking to other people about it, I think there's a great awakening right now around this, which is super encouraging to see. How this is taking so much time, I think because that hasn't been known in the way that it is now. And that frankly, construction is a very slow-moving industry. Construction takes a long time. It's a kind of brute force. The trades, the unions, the laws, the building codes, everything around it, because of the kind of, thousands of things that go into a building, are so much harder to turn around quickly than tech or, well, healthcare. We're going to be interesting to see how healthcare changes here quickly too. But the biggest, most regulated industries are going to be the hardest to move quickly. But let's hope that we can move it quicker. And I think ultimately the message I would have is at Architects, we like to think that we're at the beginning of the decision-making process. And again, we say get as upstream as possible and only do work that is half of the embodied carbon you did on the last project, or set targets for your office, set targets for yourself. And if you're not hitting them, you should probably, say no to it or find out how you can, strive to do better, because this is the challenge we all need to take on.
So one thing I've been thinking a lot in recent times, and it's in keeping with that conversation, is buildings used to last centuries when they were simpler. You go to any city in Europe and you always have an old town in the center that has medieval buildings that are still used to this day and being adapted, and people still find them very usable and livable. And it seems, based on what we discussed, that now we're getting to a level of complexity that almost dooms buildings to become obsolete every few decades. Is there a way out of this? Is there a way to design buildings that last centuries while still being environmentally friendly from an operational perspective and from an embodied carbon perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think um, the building stock that we have right now, everything that's in the world is where we need to start, right? As someone has said, the greenest building is one that already exists.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the challenge we have right now is, instead of just trying to build new, better, lower carbon, let's look at all of the buildings that exist that are the energy hogs, are the things that are driving up our emissions from an operation, and focus on them as, how do we get these things down? Because we have to have the 30%, which is the bigger question here in many ways, and in retrofitting it, not add to the embodied carbon equation of it. So how do you do a deep retrofit of a lot of the buildings, and the majority of buildings in, say, North America were built after World War II? How do we retrofit that building stock and increase the amount of units and housing and all the things that were cities, while also driving down their current operations? And if you look at, I think, the conference that I was at a couple of months ago in Los Angeles, Carbon Positive, the speaker, Ed Mazaria, basically pointed out that in a city like a city of Toronto, 50% of all emissions are in the downtown core and in those tall buildings. The other 50% is the rest of the city, is the carpet, as he put it, all the housing. So, where you are right now, if you can imagine everything from like University down to the waterfront, from, I don't know, from the Don Valley over to Spadina, is 50% of the total operational emissions of all of the city, the entire GTA.
Yeah, it's probably 50% for 10% of the surface area or something like that. Right?
This is it. And these are buildings that are, most of them are not lived in. Like right now, you think what's going on, people working from home. How much of that building footprint downtown has anybody in it, right? Of the buildings that are there, the residential ones, we just talked about them. What does any of that look like in 20 to 30 years? This is, in the structure that these are built out of primarily is reinforced concrete, which is, a relatively new material, but it's going to last forever if taken care of. And it's really a question of envelope and systems. And the buildings 100 and 200 centuries old that you're referring to in Europe were built before principally two things came along: reinforced concrete and mechanical systems, HVAC, right? So reinforced concrete, clearly Corbusier, and I think it's what's interesting about the kind of early Corbusian projects are related to right after the last epidemic and the relationship to healthcare infrastructure and the desire for like hygienic light air spaces, right? Mm-hmm. But they led to a lot of open plan, deep plan. And then once mechanical systems came along, that led to the depth of a plan and the lack of a need for passive systems to get your airflow in a building. And if I could point to one thing in the last century that's driven us to where we are as architects, it is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, which has created an architecture that's separated from the environment and every principle that we had designing beforehand about how air should move around a space on its own and how a building needs natural light. So we have a building stock, a lot of it that is deep plan and on a respirator. How do we get those buildings healthy again? I think that's where we could really start and work for the next years. It's a lot of work from every aspect of design. And then from that, I think we'll learn a lot of lessons about what architecture of the future needs to look like.
So can you give us a glimpse into how those buildings can be retrofitted to be more environmentally friendly?
I think I'm not going to pick one, but work on an envelope that can open, have a window, that you might be able to have a breeze go through your apartment. That'd be a good start, or your hospital room. I think the deep plan buildings, we should be cutting holes in them, putting courtyards into them. I think this is like where design thinking can open up solutions. And, I think where it's an excavation and a surgery on these buildings, again, to use another health anatomy, and we've got sick buildings. How do we make them healthy?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I think you've covered a lot of the questions that I haven't asked already. So I have a couple more questions for you. Based on what we've discussed and your kind of what you imagine the future of the profession to be, is there still a place for architecture in the world, and what would that practice look like? Because I personally think that the traditional role of the architect as kind of a hired consultant who works for a fee is dying because the profession wasn't able to adapt to a changing world. So I think your firm is part of the answer, or one of the possible answers to that question, but can you speak a little more to that?
Well, I mean, I can only speak for myself. Would be, I think most people get in architecture certainly not for the money or because it's lucrative. I think we all get into it because we have a desire to improve the world, and make society better through the built environment. I mean, that's why I, became an architect, for sure. It was an interest in giving form to ideas and improving people's lives, right? And our training, I think, for the most part, enables us to curate a certain conversation that wouldn't otherwise happen by providing design thinking and a kind of holistic view around the built environment. Certainly also landscape architects, planners, engineers of all disciplines. And I think the one thing that the architect is kind of like, project leader, top dog, I think the first thing is to kind of take a step back and really understand design requires a completely level playing field. And I think the one we're working right now on what a One Health approach to design is. And, through this project we're doing in Rwanda right now, introduced to the concept of One Health, which again is very prescient now, 3 years later after the project started, is basically the concept in health about the human, animal, and ecological health are inextricably linked. It started out of disease prevention, zoonotic disease prevention, which we're going through right now, meaning that, if one thing gets sick, they all get sick, and the entire, world and planetary health is interwoven. And if you're designing for One Health, I think from the healthcare profession, they brought together, veterinarians, infectious disease doctors, public health experts, epidemiologists, infectious disease doctors. They brought these people around to think about, okay, what are all the things happening in all your fields that relate to each other to answer this? And trying to think about, like, what is One Health design and what does that mean for architecture, landscape, every engineering discipline, ecology, hydrology, planning, sociology, like all the kind of things that if we really want to think about the future of our cities and planet, how do we need to be thinking about these things completely holistically and slowing down so that we really consider our decisions in a way and their the totality of their effects and impacts. And, people, I think the answer would be like, well, how am I going to afford to do that? Or how do I have enough time? And I think this is, and to your point, I think, part of the problem we typically have is, like, most professions are just seen as a service. And I think, comparing it to other professions, I'll use health right now in a system like Canada or here at the NHS, where you're a public service. It'd be interesting to think more if architecture was truly a public service, and if we figure out a way, to bring our services to a broader audience and work with more people and find a different way to fund what it is we do. Because ultimately, I don't necessarily think it's a problem of architecture. I think it's a problem of the marketplace of architecture and the markets in which we work and how that's evolved over time.
Well, it certainly seems that you guys have hit on a business model that is viable and works at least well for you. Has that been emulated by anyone?
Good question. I think there's quite a few out there now that we've seen. I think there's other nonprofits starting to pop up, and we published. We're working to publish our business model and show people how we do it. I think we certainly would like to see more people taking this on as a model practice to open it up. I think the greatest, the big hurdle is figuring out, like any architect, is finding that first project and then finding the funding. It takes gumption to make that happen. And I think, but again, work begets work, funding begets funding, and establishing momentum, it can work. And I think, again, it shouldn't limit what you do. I think we have more doors opening for us than ones that are closing. And we're not hemmed into a typology or a region, which is really interesting to see. I think, like, our work is now taking us across the globe in a very short period of time, because I think people appreciate I think the sincerity of what we do, or the fact that we work with a lot of other nonprofits. And I think there's a certain kind of, instant, I don't know what the right word is here, but understanding with, like, oh, you are too. That's interesting. And I really didn't think architects could be like that. And if you look at where work is being procured from, the vast majority of work is, like, in public sector work, is done through nonprofits. Like, any university is a nonprofit, any city is a nonprofit. So if you just think about who the clients are, it kind of makes sense.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So speaking of different business models, I've been very curious about another very different from yours, but that's also very interesting for many reasons. And it's the one embodied by the company Katera. Have you heard of them?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it's I guess you could call it a tech company that design, manufactures, and builds everything in-house using a lot of prefab. And they seem to be building more than anybody else out there. Do you have some thoughts on their business model and potential to tackle some of the issues we discussed as well?
I can't speak with too much authority, but I think the lesson you can learn from someone like Katera is someone from a tech industry seeing how slow moving and antiquated aspects of the construction industry are, and seeing the opportunity for something that moves far quicker to take advantage of it. So, I mean, I think I can only see encouragement in this, that our industry needs to move fast and change quickly. And someone as kind of big and disruptive as that coming in can only encourage change in an otherwise slow to change industry.
All right, that's great. The last question I have for you, and that's a conversation I've had with other people, including one of your British colleagues, Andrew Wall from Wall Thistleton. Why can't buildings be more like cars, where instead of being a 100% custom piece of design, you could pick from a catalog and then customize it as you see fit and put like the stitching on your leather couch or whatever. And why hasn't that happened so far? Because it seems, again, and it kind of riffs on what Katera is doing, there's also a huge opportunity to reduce the cost of architecture and possibly its carbon footprint through mass manufacturing as well.
Well, I would say if buildings were designed to last 10 years and be scrapped, I think that's probably not the model that we want to have. So I'm not sure the car is the ideal model here. A car is designed every year, has a new model that comes out, is fashionable, is designed to be obsolete in 10 to 15 years, if not less, is hugely energy intensive, clearly. Has nothing to do, unless you're from, you're not even from Detroit anymore. If you're from, God, I can't even say if you're from Oakville anymore, has probably the percentage chance that your car was made where you're from or made of materials where you're from is extremely low. I would say probably actually at this point impossible. So it has nothing to do with your region. And ultimately the car invention of the last 100 years is probably the biggest reason we have a climate crisis. So I hope architecture never resembles a car.
Fair enough. That's a great answer. Well, I want to thank you very much for your time, Kelly. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I hope we can have more of those in the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Arnaud.
Hey, Arnaud here. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and that you'll come back for more. Please share with your friends and colleagues, and remember to subscribe on our website at rvltr.studio. Follow us on social media at Révélateur_TO. It's REVELATEUR_TO. Until next time, ciao.